Linda stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Her eyes were fixed on the figure of her brother, Bob, sitting motionless on the front porch. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, but Bob seemed oblivious to the changing light. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as if he were seeing something far beyond the quiet suburban street. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. Linda sighed, her brow furrowing with concern. It had been 3 months since Bob returned from his tour of duty, but he might as well have still been halfway across the world. The brother she remembered, quick to laugh, always ready with a joke, was gone. In his place was this silent, brooding stranger who barely spoke 2 words at a time. She took a sip of her coffee, wincing at the bitter taste. Linda had never been good at brewing coffee. That had always been Bob's specialty. Another small reminder of how much things had changed. Gathering her courage, Linda stepped out onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked under her feet. But Bob didn't turn. She cleared her throat. "Morning, Bob. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Bob grunted in response, his eyes still fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Linda sat down in the chair next to him, determined to break through his shell of silence. "So, I was thinking," she began, keeping her tone light and casual. "Maybe we could grab lunch at Joe's Diner today. Remember how we used to go there every Saturday when we were kids? Dad would always order the biggest burger on the menu, and Mom would scold him about his cholesterol." For a moment, Linda thought she saw a flicker of something. Recognition, perhaps even a hint of a smile, cross Bob's face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the now familiar mask of indifference. "Can't," Bob said, his voice rough from disuse. "Got things to do." Linda bit back a sigh of frustration. "What kind of things?" she pressed. "Maybe I could help." Bob shook his head, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were bloodshot, dark circles etched beneath them. "Just things, Linda. Don't worry about it." Linda opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of small feet pattering down the hallway inside the house caught her attention. A moment later, the front door swung open, and Tyler emerged, his hair sticking up in all directions and his pajamas rumpled from sleep. "Mom!" he exclaimed, his face lighting up with a grin. "Uncle Bob, you're both up early." Linda forced a smile, reaching out to ruffle her son's hair. "Good morning, sweetie. Did you sleep well?" Tyler nodded enthusiastically, then turned his attention to Bob. "Uncle Bob, can we go fishing today? You promised to teach me how to cast a line, remember?" For a brief moment, Linda saw a flicker of life in Bob's eyes. He looked at Tyler, something almost like a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe another time, kiddo," he said softly. "Uncle Bob's got some things to take care of today." Tyler's face fell, disappointment evident in his slumped shoulders. Linda's heart ached for both of them, for her son, eager for attention from the uncle he idolized, and for her brother, clearly struggling with demons she couldn't begin to understand. As Tyler trudged back inside, muttering about breakfast, Linda turned to Bob once more. "You know," she said carefully, "Tyler really looks up to you. He thinks you're a hero." Bob's expression darkened, his jaw clenching visibly. "I'm no hero," he muttered, pushing himself to his feet. Without another word, he stalked off the porch and around the side of the house, leaving Linda alone with her cold coffee and growing concern. Later that afternoon, as Linda folded laundry in the living room, Tyler approached her with a curious expression on his face. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with the innocent wonder of childhood. "Who's the hero you were talking about earlier?" Linda froze, a half-folded t-shirt in her hands. She realized with a start that Tyler must have overheard her conversation with Bob on the porch. She hesitated, unsure how to explain the complexities of Bob's situation to an 8-year-old. "Well, sweetie," she began, choosing her words carefully. "I was talking about Uncle Bob. He did some very brave things when he was in the army." Tyler's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? Like what? Did he fight bad guys? Save people?" Linda felt a lump forming in her throat. How could she explain the reality of war to a child? How could she convey the toll it had taken on Bob without shattering Tyler's image of his uncle as a superhero? "Uncle Bob did a lot of important things," she said finally. "But being a hero isn't always about fighting bad guys or saving people. Sometimes it's about being brave in other ways, like coming home and trying to adjust to normal life again." Tyler frowned, clearly not satisfied with this answer. But if he's a hero, why does he look so sad all the time? Linda set down the laundry and pulled Tyler into a hug. "Sometimes, honey, even heroes need time to heal. The best thing we can do is be patient and show Uncle Bob how much we love him." As Tyler nodded and wandered off to play, Linda found herself staring at the family photos lining the mantelpiece. Her eyes lingered on a picture of Bob from before his deployment, grinning widely, his arms slung around her shoulders. She wondered if that version of her brother would ever fully return, or if the war had changed him irrevocably. With a heavy sigh, Linda returned to her laundry, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer and worries she couldn't voice. She only hoped that, with time and patience, she could help Bob find his way back to the family that loved him. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that only settles in the dead of night. Linda lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind too restless for sleep. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked 2:37 a.m., its red numbers casting a faint glow in the darkness. She was about to roll over and attempt sleep once more when she heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, coming from down the hall. Linda sat up, straining her ears. There it was again, a whisper, followed by what sounded like a muffled laugh. Frowning, Linda swung her legs over the side of the bed. The hardwood floor was cool beneath her bare feet as she padded silently towards the door. She paused in the hallway, listening intently. The sounds were coming from Tyler's room. A mixture of concern and curiosity propelled her forward. As she approached Tyler's door, she could make out two distinct voices, one high and childish, unmistakably Tyler's, and the other deeper, more mature. Bob's voice. Linda's heart rate quickened. What was Bob doing in Tyler's room at this hour? Her mind raced with possibilities, each more worrying than the last. She reached for the doorknob, then hesitated. Instead, she leaned closer, peering through the small gap where the door stood slightly ajar. The scene that greeted her was not at all what she had expected. Bob was kneeling beside Tyler's bed, his head bowed. Tyler sat up in bed, his small hands clasped in front of him, mimicking his uncle's posture. In the soft glow of the nightlight, Linda could see their lips moving in unison. "And please watch over Mommy and Grandma and Grandpa and all the kids at school." Tyler's voice drifted through the crack in the door. "And especially watch over Uncle Bob, 'cause he's a hero even if he doesn't think so." Linda felt her breath catch in her throat. She watched as Bob reached out and ruffled Tyler's hair affectionately. "That's good, buddy," he said softly. "Now remember what I told you about praying?" Tyler nodded eagerly. "It's not just about asking for stuff. It's about being thankful too." "That's right," Bob said, a hint of a smile in his voice. "So what are you thankful for today?" Tyler scrunched up his face in concentration. "I'm thankful for my new bike and the chocolate chip cookies Mom made, and I'm thankful you're teaching me how to pray, Uncle Bob." Linda felt a wave of emotion wash over her, relief, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. She leaned against the wall, her mind reeling. All this time she had been worried about Bob's nightly visits to Tyler's room, and it turned out he was teaching her son to pray. As she stood there, lost in thought, a memory surfaced, one she hadn't recalled in years. She was Tyler's age, maybe a little younger, kneeling beside her own bed. Her father sat next to her, his large, calloused hand enveloping her small one. "Now, Lindy," he had said, his voice gentle but firm, "praying isn't just about reciting words. It's about opening your heart. It's a conversation with God, and like any good conversation, it involves both talking and listening." Linda remembered how safe she had felt in that moment, how connected to something larger than herself. She had forgotten that feeling over the years, lost it somewhere in the rush of growing up, going to college, getting married, and having Tyler. Now, watching Bob teach Tyler the same lesson, Linda felt a lump form in her throat. She had been so focused on Bob's trauma, on the ways the war had changed him, that she had overlooked the parts of him that remained unchanged: his gentleness, his faith, his ability to connect with others on a deep level. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost missed Bob's next words to Tyler. "All right, champ," he said, ruffling Tyler's hair one last time. "Time for sleep. Remember, if you have any bad dreams, just say a little prayer. God's always listening, even when you think no one else is." Tyler nodded sleepily, snuggling down into his blankets. "Night, Uncle Bob. Love you." "Love you too, kiddo," Bob replied, his voice softer than Linda had heard it since his return. Realizing Bob was about to leave the room, Linda quickly and quietly retreated to her own bedroom. She slipped under the covers, her mind whirling with what she had witnessed. The Bob she had seen in Tyler's room, patient, kind, full of quiet wisdom, was so different from the distant, troubled man she had been seeing during the day. As she lay there in the darkness, Linda found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She clasped her hands together and began to pray. She thanked whatever higher power might be listening for this glimpse of the brother she thought she had lost. She prayed for Bob's healing, for Tyler's continued innocence and faith, and for her own ability to bridge the gap that had formed in their family. When she finally drifted off to sleep, it was with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in months. The road ahead might be long and difficult, but for the first time since Bob's return, Linda felt like they might actually find their way back to being a family again. As the first light of dawn began to seep through her curtains, Linda made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to help Bob, to show him that he was still the hero Tyler believed him to be. And maybe, just maybe, in the process of saving Bob, they might all find a way to save themselves. The next morning, Linda woke with a sense of purpose. The events of the previous night had shifted something within her, and she was determined to confront Bob about what she had seen. She rehearsed her approach as she went through her morning routine, trying to find the right words that would encourage openness without putting Bob on the defensive. As she made her way downstairs, the smell of bacon and coffee wafted up to greet her. Surprised, Linda quickened her pace. She couldn't remember the last time someone else had made breakfast in this house. The scene that greeted her in the kitchen stopped her in her tracks. Bob stood at the stove, spatula in hand, expertly flipping pancakes. Tyler sat at the table, his legs swinging enthusiastically as he chattered away about a school project. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the domestic scene. For a moment, Linda felt like an outsider in her own home. She watched as Bob slid a perfectly golden pancake onto Tyler's plate, adding a strip of bacon with a flourish. Tyler's eyes lit up with delight. "Morning, Mom," Tyler called out, finally noticing her presence. "Uncle Bob's making breakfast. He says it's Grandpa's secret recipe." Bob turned, meeting Linda's gaze. For a brief second, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a hint of the vulnerability she had witnessed the night before, but then it was gone, replaced by a casual nod of greeting. "There's coffee in the pot," he said, turning back to the stove. "Figured I'd give you a break this morning." Linda moved into the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She took a sip, surprised by how good it tasted. Another reminder of the brother she used to know, the one who could always be counted on to brew the perfect pot of coffee. She sat down at the table, watching as Bob and Tyler interacted. There was an ease between them that she hadn't noticed before, a connection that seemed to have deepened overnight. Tyler laughed at something Bob said, and Linda saw the ghost of a smile cross her brother's face. As she observed them, Linda felt a complex mix of emotions. There was gratitude, of course, for this moment of normalcy and the joy it was bringing Tyler. But there was also a twinge of something else, a hint of jealousy perhaps, at the bond forming between her son and her brother. "So," Linda said, trying to keep her tone casual, "what were you two up to last night? I thought I heard voices." Bob's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "Just having a chat with the little man here, right, buddy?" Tyler nodded enthusiastically, his mouth full of pancake. He swallowed and then launched into an excited explanation. "Uncle Bob was telling me about the stars. Did you know there are billions and billions of them? And some of them might have planets just like Earth." Linda raised an eyebrow, looking at Bob. This was news to her. "I didn't realize you were so interested in astronomy," she said. Bob shrugged, avoiding her gaze as he flipped another pancake. "Picked up a few things here and there. Kids are curious about that stuff, you know?" Linda nodded slowly, noting how Bob had skillfully deflected the conversation away from their nighttime activities. She was about to press further when Tyler piped up again. "Mom, can Uncle Bob take me to the planetarium sometime? He says they have a really cool show about space exploration." Before Linda could respond, Bob interjected. "Now hold on there, champ. I said maybe we could go sometime. Don't want to make promises we can't keep, right?" Tyler's face fell slightly, but he nodded in understanding. Linda felt a surge of frustration. She wanted to encourage this connection between Bob and Tyler, but she also didn't want her son to be disappointed if Bob's issues prevented him from following through. "Tell you what," Linda said, making a split-second decision. "Why don't we all go this weekend? It could be a family outing." Tyler's eyes lit up again, but Bob's expression remained guarded. "We'll see," he said noncommittally. "Got a lot on my plate right now." Linda opened her mouth to argue, to point out that spending time with family might be exactly what Bob needed. But the words died on her lips as she saw the tension in Bob's jaw, the way his hands gripped the edge of the counter a little too tightly. Instead, she changed tack. "Well, these pancakes are delicious," she said, forcing a lightness into her tone. "I had no idea you'd become such a good cook, Bob." For a moment, something like pride flickered across Bob's face. "Yeah, well," he mumbled, "had to learn to fend for myself over there." The "over there" hung in the air between them, a reminder of the experiences that had changed Bob so profoundly. Linda wanted to ask more, to understand what he had been through, but she knew this wasn't the time or place. As they finished breakfast, Linda found herself studying Bob, trying to reconcile the different versions of her brother she had seen in the past 24 hours. There was the distant, troubled man she had grown accustomed to since his return. There was the gentle uncle, patiently teaching Tyler about prayer and the wonders of the universe. And now, there was this domestic figure, making breakfast and almost seeming like his old self. Which one was the real Bob, Linda wondered, or were they all fragments of a man struggling to put himself back together after being shattered by war? As Tyler rushed off to get ready for school and Bob began clearing the dishes, Linda knew one thing for certain. She was more determined than ever to help her brother find his way back to himself and to their family. The path forward might be uncertain, but for the first time in months, Linda felt a glimmer of hope. They would face this challenge together, one day at a time, one pancake breakfast at a time, if that's what it took. A week had passed since the morning of pancakes and unspoken tensions. Linda had been carefully observing Bob, trying to find the right moment to broach the subject of his late-night conversations with Tyler. But every time she thought she had an opening, Bob would retreat into himself, his eyes growing distant and his responses monosyllabic. Finally, Linda decided a change of scenery might help. One sunny afternoon, she approached Bob as he sat on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon as usual. "Hey," she said, keeping her tone light. "I was thinking of grabbing a coffee at Joe's. Want to join me?" Bob looked up at her, surprise flickering across his face. For a moment, Linda thought he might refuse, but then he nodded slowly. "Sure," he said, pushing himself to his feet. "Why not?" The walk to Joe's cafe was short, but laden with memories. This was the route they had taken countless times as children, racing each other to get the best booth by the window. Now, they walked in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Joe's hadn't changed much over the years. The same neon sign flickered in the window, and the bell above the door chimed as they entered. The smell of coffee and freshly baked pies enveloped them, bringing with it a rush of nostalgia. They settled into a booth, the same one they had always favored as kids. Linda ordered 2 coffees, remembering how Bob used to take his. Black, no sugar. When the waitress brought their drinks, Linda noticed Bob's fingers trembling slightly as he reached for his cup. "So," Linda began, stirring her coffee absently, "how have you been sleeping lately?" Bob's eyes narrowed slightly. "Fine," he said, his tone guarded. "Why do you ask?" Linda took a deep breath. "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time with Tyler at night. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." For a long moment, Bob was silent, staring into his coffee as if it held the answers to questions he couldn't voice. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Tyler, he reminds me of someone I knew. Over there." Linda leaned forward, her heart racing. This was the most Bob had spoken about his experiences since returning home. "Who?" she asked gently. Bob's jaw clenched, and for a second, Linda thought he might shut down again. But then he continued, his words coming out in a rush. "There was this kid in one of the villages we were protecting. He was about Tyler's age, always curious, always asking questions." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. Linda waited, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that any interruption might break this moment of openness. "One day, there was an attack," Bob continued, his eyes unfocused, seeing something far beyond the walls of the cafe. "I tried to. I couldn't." His voice trailed off, and Linda reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "Bob," she said softly, "it wasn't your fault." Bob pulled his hand away abruptly, his eyes snapping back to the present. "You don't know that," he said, his voice harsh. "You weren't there. You don't know what happened." Linda felt a surge of frustration. "Then tell me," she urged. "Help me understand." For a moment, it seemed like Bob might do just that. His lips parted, and Linda could see the struggle in his eyes, the war between the desire to unburden himself and the fear of reliving those memories. But then, like a curtain falling, his expression closed off. "It's in the past," he said flatly. "No use dredging it up now." Linda bit back a sigh of disappointment. She had been so close to breaking through, to understanding what was haunting her brother. But she knew pushing him further right now would only cause him to retreat more. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about his plans for the week ahead. Bob seemed to relax slightly, answering with short but less guarded responses. As they talked, Linda caught glimpses of the brother she remembered, a dry joke here, a wry observation there. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, Linda made one last attempt to connect. "You know," she said carefully, "if you ever want to talk about anything, I'm here, day or night." Bob looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "I know," he said quietly. They walked home in silence, but it felt different this time, less strained, more companionable. As they approached the house, Bob paused on the sidewalk. "Linda," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Thanks. For the coffee, I mean." Linda smiled, recognizing the unspoken gratitude behind his words. "Anytime," she replied. As she watched Bob climb the porch steps and disappear into the house, Linda felt a mixture of hope and frustration. She had glimpsed the depth of Bob's pain, the weight of the memories he carried. But she had also seen flashes of the brother she knew was still in there somewhere. The road to healing would be long and difficult, Linda realized. There would be steps forward and steps back. But she was more determined than ever to help Bob find his way. Whatever secrets he was carrying, whatever horrors he had witnessed, Linda vowed to be there, ready to listen when he was finally ready to talk. For now, she would take comfort in the small victories. A shared coffee, a moment of openness, a glimpse of the old Bob. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes, Linda reminded herself as she followed Bob into the house, a start was all you needed to begin the journey of healing. In the days following their coffee shop conversation, Linda found herself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Bob's past. The brief glimpse he had offered into his wartime experiences had only intensified her desire to understand what had happened to her brother. She knew that pushing him directly for more information would likely result in him shutting down completely. So, Linda decided to take a different approach. One afternoon, while Bob was out for one of his solitary walks and Tyler was at a friend's house, Linda sat down at her computer. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, before finally typing in a search for veteran support groups in their area. As she scrolled through the results, she felt a mix of hope and apprehension. Could one of these groups help Bob? Or would the suggestion that he needed help only push him further away? Deciding she needed more information before approaching Bob, Linda picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Aunt Sarah? It's Linda." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Linda? My goodness, it's been ages. Is everything all right?" Linda took a deep breath. "I'm calling about Bob. I was hoping you might be able to help me understand what happened to him over there." Aunt Sarah had always been close to Bob. She had been the one to write to him most frequently during his deployment, and Linda knew that if anyone in the family had insight into Bob's experiences, it would be her. "Oh, Linda," Aunt Sarah sighed. "I wish I could tell you more, but Bob's been pretty tight-lipped, even with me. What I do know is that something happened during his last tour, something that shook him to his core." Linda leaned forward, hanging on every word. "Did he ever mention anything specific? A particular incident or—" "He never gave me details," Aunt Sarah interrupted. "But I remember one letter. He wrote about a village they were protecting. Said there was a boy there who reminded him of Tyler, the way he wrote about that child. I could tell he'd formed a connection." Linda felt a chill run down her spine, remembering Bob's words at the coffee shop. "What happened to the boy?" she asked, dreading the answer. There was a long pause before Aunt Sarah replied. "I don't know for certain, but in the next letter I received, Bob's tone had changed completely. He seemed broken. That was the last letter I got from him before he came home." After thanking Aunt Sarah and promising to keep in touch, Linda hung up the phone. Her mind was racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but the full picture was still frustratingly out of reach. Determined to learn more, Linda spent the next few days discreetly reaching out to other family members and old friends. Most knew little more than she did, but each conversation added a small piece to the puzzle. From Bob's old high school friend, now a fellow veteran, she learned that Bob had been part of a unit tasked with protecting civilian populations in high-risk areas. Her cousin, who worked for a Veterans Affairs office, hinted at an incident involving civilian casualties, though he couldn't provide specifics due to confidentiality. Even Tyler, in his innocent way, provided a clue. "Uncle Bob told me that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is to put down his weapon," he said one evening, as Linda tucked him into bed. As the days passed, Linda found herself watching Bob more closely than ever. She noticed things she had overlooked before. The way he flinched at sudden loud noises, how his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings when they were in public, the nightmares that left him pale and shaken in the mornings. One afternoon, while cleaning the guest room where Bob was staying, Linda came across a small worn notebook tucked between the mattress and box spring. Her hand hovered over it, the temptation to look inside nearly overwhelming, but she stopped herself, respecting Bob's privacy even as her curiosity burned. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Linda decided to take a risk. "Bob," she said softly, "I've been thinking. There's a support group for veterans at the community center. I thought maybe—" She trailed off as Bob's posture stiffened. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Linda feared she had pushed too far. But then, to her surprise, Bob spoke. "I know about the group," he said, his voice low. "My therapist at the VA suggested it." Linda blinked in surprise. "You're seeing a therapist?" Bob nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "Started a few weeks ago. Didn't want to make a big deal out of it." A wave of emotion washed over Linda. Relief that Bob was seeking help. Guilt that she hadn't realized. Hope that this might be a step towards healing. That's great, Bob," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm proud of you." Bob shrugged, but Linda could see the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. "It's not easy," he admitted, "talking about everything, but I'm trying." Linda reached out, placing her hand on Bob's arm. This time, he didn't pull away. "I'm here," she said simply. "Whatever you need." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Linda felt a shift in the air between them. The wall Bob had built around himself wasn't gone, but maybe, just maybe, a small crack had appeared. There was still so much Linda didn't know, so much that Bob wasn't ready to share. But for the first time since his return, she felt like they were truly on the same side, facing Bob's demons together. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. And sometimes, Linda reminded herself as they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, a start was all you needed to begin the journey of healing. A week after their conversation on the porch, Linda found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the calendar hanging on the wall. A date circled in red caught her eye. It was Bob's birthday next weekend. In the chaos of recent events, she had almost forgotten. An idea began to form in her mind, a way to perhaps bridge the gap between them and offer Bob a chance to reconnect with happier memories. Taking a deep breath, Linda walked into the living room where Bob was reading a book to Tyler. She waited until they finished the chapter before speaking. "Bob," she said, trying to keep her tone casual, "I was thinking about your birthday coming up. What do you say we take a little trip? Just the two of us, like old times." Bob looked up, surprise evident on his face. "A trip?" he repeated, his brow furrowing slightly. Linda nodded, her words coming out in a rush. "Remember how we used to go camping at Lake Tahoe every summer? I thought maybe we could go back there, just for a couple of days. Revisit some of our old haunts, maybe do some fishing." For a moment, Bob was silent, his expression unreadable. Linda held her breath, worried she had overstepped, but then, to her relief, a small smile tugged at the corner of Bob's mouth. "Tahoe, huh?" he said, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "Been a long time since we've been up there." "Too long," Linda agreed, feeling a surge of hope. "So what do you say? Are you up for it?" Bob hesitated, glancing at Tyler, who was watching the exchange with curious eyes. "I don't know, Linda. It's a nice thought, but..." "But what?" Linda pressed gently. "It's just a couple of days. The fresh air might do us both some good." She could see the conflict playing out on Bob's face, the desire to retreat, warring with the pull of childhood memories. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Bob nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Let's do it." The next few days were a flurry of preparation. Linda dug their old camping gear out of the garage, surprised at how familiar it all felt. She caught Bob examining their father's old fishing rod, a faraway look in his eyes, and felt a glimmer of hope that this trip might be exactly what they needed. As they loaded up the car early Saturday morning, Tyler stood on the porch, trying his best to hide his disappointment at being left behind. "You be good for Grandma and Grandpa, okay?" Linda said, giving him a tight hug. "We'll be back before you know it." "Okay, Mom." Tyler nodded, then turned to Bob. "Bring me back a fish, Uncle Bob." For a moment, Linda saw a genuine smile light up Bob's face. "I'll do my best, kiddo," he promised, ruffling Tyler's hair affectionately. The drive to Lake Tahoe was quiet at first, the silence broken only by the soft music playing on the radio. But as the urban sprawl gave way to pine-covered mountains, Linda noticed Bob starting to relax, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. "Remember that summer when Dad tried to teach us how to water ski?" Linda said, breaking the silence. Bob chuckled, the sound warming Linda's heart. "How could I forget? You were so determined to stay up, you didn't realize you'd lost your swimsuit until you were halfway across the lake." They spent the rest of the drive trading memories, each story seeming to chip away at the wall Bob had built around himself. By the time they reached their old campsite, the tension that had defined their relationship for months had eased considerably. Setting up camp was like stepping back in time. They fell into their old roles effortlessly, Bob assembling the tent while Linda organized their supplies. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, they sat by the campfire, roasting hot dogs just like they used to as kids. "This was a good idea, Linda," Bob said quietly, staring into the flames. "Thank you." Linda smiled, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I'm glad we did this," she replied. "I've missed this. Missed you." Bob nodded, his expression softening. "I've missed this too, more than I realized." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, the only sounds. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Linda sensed a shift in Bob's demeanor. "Linda," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you about what happened over there." Linda's heart raced, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm here, Bob, whenever you're ready." Bob took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the dying embers of the fire. "It's not easy to talk about," he began. "But being here, remembering simpler times, it makes me want to try." As Bob began to speak, haltingly at first, then with increasing openness, Linda listened with a mixture of horror and compassion. The story that unfolded, of impossible choices, of lives lost and saved, of guilt and trauma that no one should have to bear, helped her understand, for the first time, the true weight of what Bob had been carrying. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and still Bob talked. And Linda listened, offering nothing but her presence and her unconditional support. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, Bob fell silent, emotionally exhausted but somehow lighter. Linda reached out, taking her brother's hand in hers. No words were necessary. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of nature and the echoes of happier times, a bridge had been built. The road to healing would still be long and difficult, but they would walk it together, one step at a time. As the sun rose over Lake Tahoe, casting its warm light over the siblings, Linda felt a renewed sense of hope. This trip hadn't solved everything, but it had opened a door. And sometimes, she reflected as Bob gave her hand a gentle squeeze, that was all you needed to start finding your way back home. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, flickering light over the small clearing. Bob and Linda sat side by side, their shoulders touching, a shared blanket draped over their laps to ward off the chill of the night. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and wood smoke, and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Bob's voice was low and rough with emotion as he finally revealed the full extent of what had happened during his last tour. There was this village, he began, his eyes fixed on the dying fire. We'd been there for weeks trying to establish a safe zone. There was this kid, Ahmed. Bright kid, always asking questions, reminded me so much of Tyler. Linda listened intently, her heart aching for her brother and the weight he'd been carrying. She remained silent, afraid that any interruption might cause Bob to retreat back into himself. One day, we got intel about an incoming attack. We had to evacuate the village quickly. It was chaos, Linda. People screaming, running everywhere. I was helping this old couple when I heard gunfire. Bob's voice cracked, and he paused, taking a shuddering breath. By the time I got there, it was too late. Ahmed, he was just lying there, so still, so small. Linda felt tears welling up in her eyes. She reached out and took Bob's hand, squeezing it gently. "Oh, Bob," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Bob shook his head, his jaw clenched tight. "I should have been there. I should have protected him. That's what we were there for, wasn't it? To protect people. And I failed." "You didn't fail, Bob," Linda said firmly. "You were doing your job. You can't be everywhere at once." "Try telling that to Ahmed's family," Bob replied bitterly, "or to the part of me that sees his face every time I close my eyes." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of Bob's confession hanging heavily between them. Linda struggled to find the right words, knowing that nothing she could say would erase the pain and guilt her brother was feeling. Finally, Bob spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's why I've been spending so much time with Tyler. When I'm with him, teaching him things, watching him learn and grow, it's like I'm getting a second chance, a chance to protect and guide the way I couldn't with Ahmed." Linda felt a surge of understanding wash over her. All this time, she'd been worried about Bob's influence on Tyler, when in reality, Tyler had been a lifeline for Bob, a reason to keep going when the weight of his memories threatened to pull him under. "Bob," she said softly, "what happened to Ahmed was a tragedy, but you can't keep punishing yourself for something that was out of your control. Tyler adores you, and you're an amazing uncle to him. That matters. That's real." Bob nodded slowly, but Linda could see the doubt still lingering in his eyes. "I know," he said. "Logically, I know that. But some days, the guilt is just overwhelming." Linda took a deep breath, deciding to share something she'd been holding back. "I understand more than you might think," she said. "After my divorce, there were days when I felt like I'd failed Tyler, like I'd ruined his chance at a happy family. The guilt was crushing." Bob looked at her, surprise evident on his face. "You never told me that," he said. I didn't tell anyone, Linda admitted. I was ashamed, but I've learned that holding on to that guilt doesn't help anyone, least of all Tyler. We can't change the past, Bob. All we can do is try to be better, do better, in the present. As they talked, the sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in soft pinks and golds. Linda watched as Bob's expression slowly changed, the hard lines of guilt and pain softening just a bit. You know, Bob said, a ghost of a smile playing at his lips. Tyler asked me the other day why stars twinkle. I didn't know the answer, so we looked it up together. Turns out it's because of the Earth's atmosphere distorting the light. Kid was fascinated. Linda smiled, recognizing this for the olive branch it was. He's lucky to have you, she said. We both are. Bob nodded, his gaze fixed on the lightening sky. I'm not okay, Linda, he said after a moment. I don't know if I'll ever be completely okay, but being here, talking like this, it helps. Then we'll keep talking, Linda promised. Whenever you need to, day or night. And we'll get you whatever other help you need too. You're not alone in this, Bob. Not anymore. As the sun crested the horizon, casting its warm light over the lake, Linda felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in months. The road ahead would still be difficult, filled with ups and downs, good days and bad, but they would face it together, as a family. Bob stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. What do you say we try to catch that fish for Tyler? He asked, a hint of his old enthusiasm creeping into his voice. Linda grinned, getting to her feet. Sounds perfect, she said. But fair warning, I'm probably still terrible at baiting the hook. As they gathered their fishing gear and headed down to the lake, Linda realized that this trip had given them more than just a chance to reconnect. It had given them a new beginning, a foundation on which to rebuild their relationship and help Bob find his way back to himself. The healing process would take time, but for the first time in a long while, Linda felt confident that they were on the right path. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one shared moment of joy and understanding at a time. The days following their return from Lake Tahoe brought a subtle but noticeable shift in the household dynamics. Bob, while still struggling with his inner demons, seemed more present, more engaged. Linda watched with a mixture of joy and apprehension as the relationship between Bob and Tyler deepened, evolving into something that looked increasingly like a father-son bond. One sunny afternoon, Linda stood at the kitchen window, absently drying dishes as she observed Bob and Tyler in the backyard. They were hunched over Tyler's science project, a model of the solar system that had been giving him trouble for days. Bob's hands moved with practiced ease, showing Tyler how to secure the planets to their orbits. See, buddy? Bob's voice drifted through the open window. It's all about balance. Each planet needs to be just the right distance from the sun. Tyler nodded eagerly, his face scrunched in concentration as he mimicked Bob's movements. Like real life, right, Uncle Bob? Everything has to be in the right place, or it all falls apart. Bob paused, a shadow passing over his face. Yeah, he said softly. Something like that. Linda felt a lump form in her throat. These moments of connection between Bob and Tyler were beautiful, but they also stirred a complex mix of emotions within her. Pride in Bob's progress, gratitude for the positive influence he was having on Tyler, but also a twinge of something else, a feeling she was hesitant to name. Later that evening, after Tyler had gone to bed, Linda found Bob sitting on the porch, staring up at the night sky. She settled into the chair beside him, handing him a steaming mug of tea. Tyler's really coming along with that science project, she said, trying to keep her tone light. He's lucky to have your help. Bob nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He's a smart kid. Reminds me of how we used to be, always curious about everything. Linda hesitated, then decided to voice the thought that had been nagging at her. "You're really good with him, Bob. It's nice to see." Bob turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim porch light. "But," he prompted, sensing her unspoken words. Linda sighed, struggling to articulate her feelings without sounding ungrateful or selfish. "It's just, sometimes I worry that I'm being pushed to the sidelines. Tyler looks up to you so much, and I'm thrilled about that, I really am. But sometimes I feel like I'm losing my place in his life." The words hung in the air between them, and Linda immediately wished she could take them back. But to her surprise, Bob nodded in understanding. "I get it," he said softly. "I'm not trying to replace you, Linda. You're his mother. That's a bond I could never touch, even if I wanted to." "I know that," Linda replied, feeling a rush of relief at Bob's understanding. "I guess I'm just not used to sharing him like this. It's been just the two of us for so long." Bob was quiet for a moment, his gaze returning to the stars above. "You know," he said finally, "when I'm with Tyler, teaching him things, watching him figure stuff out, it helps. It gives me purpose, you know? Makes me feel like maybe I can do some good in this world after all." Linda felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "You do good, Bob. Every day. I hope you know that." Bob shrugged, but Linda could see the ghost of a smile on his face. "I'm trying," he said. "Some days are harder than others, but I'm trying." They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their tea and watching the stars. Linda found herself reflecting on the journey they'd been on over the past few months. The fears, the misunderstandings, the gradual rebuilding of trust and connection. "Bob," she said suddenly, "I want you to know how grateful I am. For everything you've done for Tyler, for being here even when it's hard. You're giving him something I never could on my own." Bob turned to her, surprise evident in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Linda smiled, feeling a weight lift from her chest as she put her feelings into words. "You're showing him what it means to be strong, even when you're struggling. You're teaching him about resilience, about facing your fears. Those are lessons he'll carry with him for the rest of his life." Bob's eyes glistened in the moonlight, and he quickly looked away, clearing his throat. "Thanks, Linda," he said gruffly. That means a lot." As they sat there, the cool night air wrapping around them like a blanket, Linda felt a sense of peace settle over her. Yes, their family dynamic was changing, evolving into something new and unfamiliar. But maybe that wasn't something to fear. Maybe it was something to embrace, to nurture. The road ahead would still have its challenges. There would be difficult days, moments of doubt and struggle. But as Linda looked at her brother, seeing the man he was becoming rather than the shadows of his past, she felt a surge of hope. Together, they were creating something beautiful, a family bound not just by blood, but by shared experiences, mutual understanding, and unconditional love. And in that moment, under the vast expanse of the starry sky, Linda knew that they would be okay. More than okay. They would thrive. The weeks following their heart-to-heart on the porch brought a sense of normalcy to the household that Linda hadn't realized she'd been missing. Bob's therapy sessions seemed to be helping, and his interactions with both Linda and Tyler were becoming more relaxed and natural. Yet Linda couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something Bob was holding back. One rainy afternoon, as Linda was sorting through old papers in the attic, she came across a dusty shoebox tucked away in a corner. Curious, she opened it to find a stack of letters, all addressed to Bob during his deployment. Most were from family and friends, but one caught her eye. It was unopened, the return address smudged and illegible. Linda's hand hovered over the envelope, torn between respecting Bob's privacy and her growing concern. After a moment's hesitation, she picked up the letter, turning it over in her hands. The postmark date was just a week before Bob's return home. Before she could decide what to do, She heard footsteps on the attic stairs. Quickly, she shoved the letter into her pocket, just as Bob's head appeared through the trapdoor. "Hey," he said, looking around at the scattered boxes. "Need any help up here?" Linda forced a smile, trying to calm her racing heart. "Just doing some spring cleaning," she said lightly. "Thought I might find some of Dad's old fishing lures for your next trip with Tyler." Bob nodded, his eyes scanning the cluttered space. For a moment, Linda thought she saw a flicker of recognition when his gaze passed over the shoebox, but it was gone so quickly she couldn't be sure. That night, after Tyler was in bed and Bob had retreated to his room, Linda sat at the kitchen table, the unopened letter before her. The weight of the secret felt heavy on her shoulders. Should she give it to Bob? Open it herself? Pretend she never found it? With a deep breath, she carefully opened the envelope, telling herself she was doing this out of concern for her brother. As she unfolded the letter, her eyes widened in shock. The letter was from Bob himself, addressed to their parents. It was dated just days before the incident he had described at the campfire. Linda's hands trembled as she read, "Mom and Dad, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to send this. Things are bad here, worse than I've let on. There's talk of an attack on the village we're protecting. I'm scared, not just for myself, but for these people, especially the kids. There's this boy, Ahmed. He reminds me so much of Tyler. I've been teaching him English, showing him pictures of home. He has so many dreams. I keep thinking about what you always told us, Dad, about how being brave doesn't mean not being afraid, but doing what's right even when you are afraid. I'm trying to hold on to that. If something happens to me, please tell Linda I'm sorry for being so distant. Tell her I love her and Tyler more than I could ever express. And tell Tyler that his Uncle Bob did his best to be the kind of man he could be proud of. I hope I'll be home soon to tell you all this in person. But if not, know that I love you all, Bob." Linda sat back, tears streaming down her face. The raw emotion in Bob's words, the fear and vulnerability he had expressed, hit her like a physical blow. This was the missing piece, the key to understanding the full weight of what Bob had been carrying. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Bob enter the kitchen. It wasn't until he spoke that she realized she wasn't alone. "I wondered what happened to that letter," Bob said quietly. Linda looked up, startled. "Bob, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have..." Bob held up a hand, cutting her off. "It's okay," he said, taking a seat across from her. "Maybe it's time you knew." For the next hour, Bob talked. He filled in the gaps of his story, explaining how he had written the letter in a moment of fear and doubt, but had ultimately decided not to send it, not wanting to worry their parents. He spoke of the attack on the village, of his desperate attempts to save Ahmed and the others, and of the crushing guilt he felt in the aftermath. "I couldn't bear to open that letter when I got home," Bob said, his voice hoarse. "It felt like a reminder of my failure, of all the things I couldn't protect." Linda reached across the table, taking Bob's hand in hers. "You didn't fail, Bob," she said firmly. "You were brave in ways most people can't even imagine. That letter, it shows how much you cared, how deeply you felt your responsibility. That's not failure, that's strength." Bob squeezed her hand, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I've been trying to tell myself that," he admitted. "Some days I even believe it." As the night wore on, Linda felt a shift in their relationship. The last barrier between them had fallen, replaced by a deeper understanding and a renewed commitment to healing together. When they finally said goodnight, Linda watched Bob walk back to his room, his shoulders straighter, as if a weight had been lifted. She knew there would still be difficult days ahead, but for the first time, she felt truly confident that they would face them together as a family united by love, understanding, and the unbreakable bonds of shared experience. The discovery of Bob's letter marked a turning point in the family's journey. While it brought to light the depth of Bob's struggles, it also opened the door for more honest communication. However, the path to healing is rarely smooth, and the family was about to face their greatest challenge yet. One evening, as Linda was preparing dinner, she heard raised voices coming from the living room. She rushed in to find Bob and Tyler in the midst of what appeared to be a heated argument. "You don't understand," Tyler was shouting, his face red with anger and frustration. "You can't just tell me what to do all the time." Bob's face was a mask of shock and hurt. "Tyler, I'm just trying to help. You know I only want what's best for you." Linda stepped between them, her heart racing. "What's going on here?" she demanded, looking from her son to her brother. Tyler, his eyes brimming with tears, blurted out, "Uncle Bob won't let me go to Jake's party on Friday. He says it's too dangerous, that something might happen. But nothing's going to happen. He's just being paranoid." Linda turned to Bob, who was standing rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. "Bob?" she questioned softly. Bob's voice was tight when he responded. "Linda, you know Jake's older brother. He's trouble, and their parents are out of town. It's not safe." "You can't protect me from everything," Tyler shouted. "I'm not a little kid anymore, and I'm not Ahmed." The moment the words left Tyler's mouth, a deathly silence fell over the room. Bob's face drained of color, and he stumbled backward, as if he'd been struck. Without a word, he turned and fled from the room, the front door slamming behind him. Linda stood frozen, her mind reeling. She had never told Tyler about Ahmed, which meant... "Tyler," she said slowly, turning to her son. "How do you know about Ahmed?" Tyler's anger had evaporated, replaced by a look of guilt and fear. I overheard you and Uncle Bob talking that night in the kitchen," he admitted. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I heard my name and..." Linda closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them, she fixed Tyler with a stern look. "We'll discuss your eavesdropping later. Right now, I need you to understand something. What you just said to your uncle was incredibly hurtful. You had no right to use that information against him." Tyler nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I was just so angry and it just came out." Linda pulled her son into a hug, her own eyes welling up. "I know, sweetie. But now, we need to make this right." After calming Tyler down and sending him to his room to think about what he'd done, Linda grabbed her coat and headed out to look for Bob. She found him sitting on a bench in the nearby park, staring blankly at the ground. As she approached, Bob spoke without looking up. "I've ruined everything, haven't I?" Linda sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "No, Bob, you haven't ruined anything." "I pushed too hard," Bob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my fear control me, and now Tyler hates me." Linda shook her head firmly. "Tyler doesn't hate you. He's a teenager, Bob. They say hurtful things sometimes. It doesn't mean they don't love you." Bob finally looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed. "But he's right, isn't he? I've been trying to protect him from everything because I couldn't protect Ahmed. I've been using him to try and fix my own guilt." Linda took Bob's hand in hers. "You've been loving him, Bob. Yes, maybe you've been overprotective at times, but that comes from a place of love and concern. Tyler knows that, even if he's having trouble expressing it right now." They sat in silence for a while, the cool evening air wrapping around them. Finally, Bob spoke again. "How do I fix this, Linda? How do I make it right?" Linda squeezed his hand. "We go home. We talk to Tyler. We be honest with him about everything, your experiences, your fears, your love for him. And then we listen to him. Really listen, because he needs to know that his feelings and opinions matter too." Bob nodded slowly. "And the party?" Linda smiled softly. We'll discuss it as a family. Find a compromise that everyone can live with. That's what families do." As they walked home together, Linda felt a mix of apprehension and hope. This evening had brought pain and harsh truths to light, but it had also created an opportunity for greater understanding and growth. When they entered the house, they found Tyler waiting for them in the living room, his eyes red from crying. As soon as he saw Bob, he launched himself into his uncle's arms. "I'm so sorry, Uncle Bob," Tyler sobbed. "I didn't mean it. I love you." Bob held Tyler tightly, his own tears falling freely. "I love you too, buddy. More than you could ever know." Linda watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with love for both of them. She knew they had a long conversation ahead, filled with difficult truths and painful memories. But she also knew that they would emerge from it stronger, their bonds deepened by honesty and mutual understanding. As the three of them sat down to talk, Linda felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was what healing looked like. Messy, painful, but ultimately beautiful in its rawness and authenticity. Together, they would navigate this new chapter, learning and growing as individuals and as a family. The road ahead might not be easy, but with love, patience, and understanding, they would face whatever challenges came their way, united in their commitment to each other and to healing the wounds of the past. Jake sat at his desk, staring at the jumble of letters on the page before him. The words seemed to dance and shift, refusing to come into focus. He squinted, willing the letters to make sense, but they remained stubbornly incomprehensible. Frustration bubbled up inside him, threatening to spill over. If you love your family and want to listen to amazing and shocking stories, click on subscribe and avoid 20 years of bad luck in your life. He'd been at this for hours, trying to decipher the seemingly simple homework assignment. But for Jake, nothing about reading was simple. The more he struggled, the more isolated he felt. His classmates breezed through their assignments while he was left behind, drowning in a sea of letters that refused to cooperate. Jake pushed his chair back from the desk, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. He ran his hands through his hair, tugging at the strands in frustration. The room felt suffocating, closing in around him. He wanted to scream, to throw the book across the room, to do anything to release the pent-up anger and disappointment. From the hallway, Kate observed Jake's struggle. Her heart ached as she watched her stepson battle with something that came so easily to others. She longed to rush in, to wrap her arms around him and tell him it would be okay, but she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Their relationship was still new, still fragile. Jake had made it clear from the beginning that he didn't need or want a new mother. Kate understood his resentment, but it didn't make the rejection any easier to bear. She watched as Jake's shoulders slumped in defeat, and she felt utterly helpless. Kate retreated to the kitchen, her mind racing with possibilities. There had to be something she could do, some way to help Jake without overstepping her bounds. She busied herself with preparing dinner, all the while formulating plans and discarding them just as quickly. Later that evening, Kate found David in his study, buried in work as usual. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. "David," she said softly, not wanting to startle him, "can we talk about Jake?" David looked up from his computer, his brow furrowed. "What about him?" Kate perched on the edge of a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm worried about him. He's really struggling with his schoolwork, especially reading. I think we should consider getting him some extra help." David's expression hardened. "Jake's fine. He just needs to apply himself more." Kate felt a spark of frustration ignite within her. "But David, I've seen him. He's trying so hard, but it's like the words just won't cooperate. I really think there might be something more going on." David turned back to his computer, effectively dismissing her concerns. "He's a teenager, Kate. They all go through phases. He'll grow out of it. Kate opened her mouth to argue further, but thought better of it. She could see the tension in David's shoulders, the way he refused to meet her eyes. The separation from Lisa was still raw, and anything involving Jake was a sensitive subject. She stood up, feeling defeated. "All right," she said softly. "But if things don't improve, we need to consider other options." David grunted noncommittally, already engrossed in his work again. Kate left the study, her mind whirling with worry and determination. If David wouldn't help, she'd have to find another way to reach Jake. As she walked past Jake's room, she heard a muffled thud followed by a string of curse words. Her heart clenched. She wanted nothing more than to go to him, to offer comfort and support. But she knew her presence would likely only make things worse. Kate retreated to her own room, closing the door softly behind her. She sank onto the bed, feeling the weight of helplessness settle over her. How could she help Jake when he didn't want her help? How could she be a mother to a boy who already had a mother? She thought back to her own childhood, to the struggles she'd faced and overcome. There had to be a way to connect with Jake, to show him that he wasn't alone. As she lay there in the darkness, an idea began to form. It was risky, and Jake might reject it outright, but she had to try. For Jake's sake, and for the sake of their fragile family, she had to find a way to bridge the gap between them. As the house settled into the quiet of night, Kate crept silently down the hallway. Her heart raced as she approached Jake's room, a book clutched tightly to her chest. She hesitated for a moment, her hand on the doorknob, before slowly turning it and easing the door open. The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of a nightlight. Jake's steady breathing filled the air, a reassuring sound in the stillness. Kate tiptoed to his bedside table, careful not to disturb the scattered papers and pens that covered its surface. With trembling hands, she placed the book on the table. It was a well-worn copy of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, a story about a young boy with autism navigating a complex world. Kate hoped that Jake might find some comfort in the protagonist's struggle to understand the world around him. As she turned to leave, Kate allowed herself a moment to look at Jake. In sleep, his face was relaxed, free from the frustration and anger that often clouded his features during the day. She resisted the urge to brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead, not wanting to risk waking him. With one last glance at the book, Kate slipped out of the room, closing the door as quietly as she had opened it. She leaned against the wall in the hallway, her heart pounding. It was a small gesture, but she hoped it might be the beginning of something more. The next morning, Jake stirred awake, his eyes slowly adjusting to the light filtering through his curtains. As he sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his gaze fell on the unfamiliar book on his bedside table. Curiosity overcame his initial confusion. Jake reached for the book, running his fingers over the cover. The title was intriguing, and despite his usual aversion to reading, he found himself opening to the first page. The words were still challenging, still seemed to shift and dance before his eyes, but something about this book felt different. Maybe it was the unique narrative voice, or the mystery presented in the opening lines, but Jake found himself drawn in. He struggled through the first few paragraphs, having to reread sentences multiple times to grasp their meaning. But instead of the usual frustration, he felt a spark of determination. He wanted to understand this story, to unravel its mystery. Time slipped away as Jake became absorbed in the book. He didn't even notice Kate standing in his doorway, a mixture of hope and anxiety on her face. "Jake?" she said softly, not wanting to startle him. "I made breakfast if you're hungry." Jake looked up, surprise flickering across his face. He hadn't heard her approach. For a moment, he considered snapping at her, pushing her away as he usually did. But something stopped him. I'm not really hungry," he mumbled, his eyes darting back to the book. Kate nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "That's okay. I noticed you were reading. Is it interesting?" Jake shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "It's different. The main character, he sees things differently. Kind of like..." He trailed off, not wanting to admit the similarities he felt with the protagonist. Kate took a tentative step into the room. "Like you?" she offered gently. Jake's defenses immediately went up. He closed the book with a snap, his face flushing. "I don't need your help," he said, his voice hard. "I'm not stupid, you know." Kate's heart sank, but she kept her voice calm. "I never thought you were, Jake. I just thought, well, I struggled with reading when I was your age too. I thought maybe we could read it together." Jake's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in suspicion. "You? But you're always reading." Kate smiled softly. "Now I am. But it wasn't always easy. I had to work at it, just like you're doing." For a moment, Jake seemed to consider her words. Kate held her breath, hoping she hadn't pushed too far. Then, Jake's expression closed off again. "I don't need your pity," he said, turning away from her. "Just leave me alone." Kate's shoulders slumped, but she nodded. "Okay, Jake. If you change your mind, I'm here." As she left the room, Kate fought back tears. She had hoped this might be a breakthrough, a chance to connect with her stepson. Instead, it felt like she had only pushed him further away. But as she headed downstairs, she didn't see Jake pick up the book again, didn't see the way his fingers traced the cover, a mix of longing and fear in his eyes. She didn't know that her small act of kindness had planted a seed, one that would take time to grow, but would eventually bloom into something beautiful and unexpected. Several nights passed, each one a silent dance of hesitation and curiosity. Jake found himself drawn to the book Kate had left, reading a few pages each night before sleep claimed him. The story captivated him, offering a window into a world that felt startlingly familiar. One evening, as Jake struggled with a particularly challenging passage, a soft knock on his door broke his concentration. Kate's voice, tentative and hopeful, called out, "Jake, may I come in?" Jake hesitated, his instinct to refuse warring with a growing desire for help. Finally, he mumbled, "Yeah, okay." Kate entered, her eyes immediately falling on the open book in Jake's lap. A small smile tugged at her lips, but she quickly schooled her expression into neutrality. "How's the reading going?" she asked, careful to keep her tone casual. Jake shrugged, but there was less hostility in the gesture than usual. "It's hard," he admitted reluctantly, "but I want to know what happens next." Kate perched on the edge of his bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "Would you like some help?" she offered gently. "We could read it together if you'd like." Jake's pride reared up, ready to reject the offer. But the frustration of the past few nights, coupled with his genuine interest in the story, won out. "Okay," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. And so began their nightly ritual. Kate would sit beside Jake, helping him sound out difficult words and explaining confusing passages. At first, their interactions were stiff and awkward, but as the days passed, a tentative comfort began to grow between them. One night, as they finished a particularly emotional chapter, Kate found herself sharing a story from her own childhood. "You know," she said softly, "when I was about your age, I was terrified of reading aloud in class." Jake looked at her skeptically. "Really? But you're so good at it now." Kate laughed, a warm sound that filled the room. "Oh, I wasn't always. I used to stutter and stumble over words. The other kids would laugh, and I'd feel so small and stupid." Jake's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition passing over his face. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I practiced," Kate said simply. "Every night I'd read to my stuffed animals. They were a very forgiving audience. A ghost of a smile touched Jake's lips, the first Kate had seen directed at her. It faded quickly, replaced by a furrowed brow. Do you think I'll ever be good at reading?" Kate's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. "Jake," she said earnestly, "I know you will. You're already improving so much. It just takes time and practice." Jake nodded, his eyes distant. Then, in a rush, as if afraid he'd lose his courage, he blurted out, "I hate school. Everyone thinks I'm dumb because I can't read as fast as them." Kate listened as Jake poured out his frustrations, years of pent-up emotions spilling forth. He spoke of the humiliation of being called on in class, of the exhaustion that came from constantly struggling to keep up, of the loneliness of feeling different from everyone else. As Jake talked, Kate felt a connection forming between them, fragile but real. She shared her own experiences, the strategies she'd developed to overcome her reading difficulties, the way she'd learned to advocate for herself. Their conversation stretched long into the night, punctuated by laughter and, at times, tears. When Jake finally yawned, his eyes heavy with sleep, Kate stood to leave. "Kate?" Jake called as she reached the door. She turned, her heart skipping a beat at the use of her name instead of the usual curt "you" he typically employed. "Yeah, Jake?" "Thanks," he said softly. "For the book. And for understanding." Kate smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. "Anytime, Jake. Sleep well." Maybe with Kate's help, he could overcome the challenges that had held him back for so long. As he drifted off to sleep, the book clutched to his chest. Jake's mind was filled not with anxiety about the next day's classes, but with the stories Kate had shared and the possibility of a brighter future. As the days turned into weeks, a subtle but noticeable change came over Jake. The perpetual cloud of frustration that had shadowed him began to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. His shoulders, once hunched with the weight of his struggles, now carried a hint of confidence. David, who had been so consumed by his own turmoil following the separation from Lisa, couldn't help but notice the shift in his son's demeanor. One evening, as Jake bounded down the stairs with an uncharacteristic spring in his step, David caught his arm gently. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. "You seem different lately. Is everything okay?" Jake paused, caught off guard by his father's observation. He fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, a habit he'd developed when nervous. "Yeah, Dad, everything's fine." David pressed on, encouraged by Jake's lack of immediate withdrawal. "You just seem happier. Has something changed at school?" Jake hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "Not really at school," he admitted, "but I've been reading more at home." David's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Reading? That's great, Jake. What brought this on?" A faint blush colored Jake's cheeks. "Kate's been helping me," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. "We've been reading together at night." David felt a complex mix of emotions wash over him. Pride in his son's progress warred with a twinge of jealousy that Kate had managed to connect with Jake in a way he hadn't. That's wonderful, son," he managed, his voice slightly strained. "I'm glad you're enjoying reading more." Jake nodded, then quickly excused himself, leaving David standing alone in the hallway, lost in thought. Later that night, as Jake settled into bed, his mind drifted to the conversation with his father. A familiar book lay on his nightstand, waiting for Kate's arrival. But tonight, a new idea began to take shape in Jake's mind. When Kate's soft knock came, Jake called out, "Come in." His voice tinged with an unusual nervousness. Kate entered, her face brightening at the sight of Jake already holding the book. But before she could take her usual seat, Jake spoke up. "I was thinking," he started, his words coming out in a rush. Maybe maybe we could invite Dad to join us tonight?" Kate's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, Jake," she said softly, "that's a wonderful idea. Are you sure you're comfortable with that?" Jake nodded, though his grip on the book tightened slightly. "Yeah, I think so. It's just, he noticed I was happier, and I told him about our reading. He seemed, I don't know, kind of sad." Kate's heart swelled with pride at Jake's perceptiveness and empathy. "I think your dad would love that," she said warmly. "Why don't you go ask him?" Jake slid out of bed, padding down the hallway to David's study. He knocked tentatively, poking his head around the door when he heard his father's distracted, "Come in." "Dad?" Jake said, his voice small. Kate and I were wondering if you wanted to join us for reading tonight?" David looked up from his computer, surprise evident on his face. For a moment, he didn't speak, and Jake felt his courage wavering. But then a slow smile spread across David's features. "I'd love to, Jake," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just give me a minute to finish up here, okay?" Jake nodded, a mixture of relief and anxiety churning in his stomach as he returned to his room. Kate was still there, her face a mask of encouragement. "He said yes," Jake reported, climbing back into bed. "He'll be here in a minute." Kate squeezed his hand gently. "That's great, Jake. I'm really proud of you for suggesting this." As they waited for David, a tense silence fell over the room. Jake fidgeted with the book, suddenly second-guessing his decision. What if he stumbled over the words? What if his dad got frustrated with how slow he read? When David finally appeared in the doorway, Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. But as his father settled into the chair by the bed, his face open and eager, Jake felt some of his anxiety begin to dissipate. "So," David said, glancing between Jake and Kate, "how does this usually work?" Kate explained their routine, and soon, Jake found himself reading aloud, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger as he progressed. When he stumbled over a word, Kate gently guided him through it, while David listened attentively, offering encouraging nods. As the chapter came to a close, Jake looked up to see both Kate and David beaming at him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of true accomplishment, of being part of something bigger than himself. But as David bid them good night and left the room, Jake couldn't shake a nagging feeling of guilt. He'd shared this special time with Kate for weeks, keeping it secret from his father. Now that David knew, would things change? Would Kate still want to spend this time with him? As if reading his thoughts, Kate placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This doesn't change anything between us, Jake," she said softly. "I'm here for you, always." Jake nodded, a lump forming in his throat. As Kate left the room, closing the door softly behind her, Jake was left to ponder the complex emotions swirling within him. He'd taken a big step tonight, opening up to his father, but he realized there was still a long road ahead in navigating the delicate balance of his newly formed family dynamic. As Jake's reading sessions with Kate continued, often with David joining them, a subtle change began to take root in the household. The tension that had permeated the air since Kate's arrival seemed to dissipate, replaced by a cautious warmth. However, this newfound harmony was not without its challenges. One sunny afternoon, as Jake sat on the front porch, engrossed in a book Kate had recommended, he heard the creak of a garden gate. Looking up, he saw Mrs. Thompson, their elderly neighbor, making her way slowly up the path. "Well, hello there, Jake," Mrs. Thompson called out, her voice warm and slightly quavery. "It's nice to see you outside for a change, and with a book, no less." Jake felt a flush creep up his neck. He'd always liked Mrs. Thompson, but her keen observations sometimes made him uncomfortable. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson," he mumbled, closing the book self-consciously. Mrs. Thompson's eyes twinkled with interest. "You know," she said, leaning on her cane, "I've been watching you and your stepmother lately. You two seem to be getting along better these days." Jake shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Mrs. Thompson, sensing his unease, softened her approach. "Why don't you come over for a cup of tea sometime? We could chat about that book you're reading." To Jake's surprise, he found himself nodding. "Okay," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That sounds nice." The following week, Jake found himself seated in Mrs. Thompson's cozy living room, surrounded by shelves upon shelves of books. The scent of Earl Grey tea wafted through the air as Mrs. Thompson poured them each a cup. "So, tell me about this book you're reading," Mrs. Thompson said, settling into her armchair. Jake launched into an explanation, his initial hesitation fading as he described the plot and characters. Mrs. Thompson listened intently, nodding and asking questions that made Jake think more deeply about the story. As their conversation flowed, Mrs. Thompson's eyes took on a distant look. "You know, Jake," she said softly, "I wasn't always the bookworm you see before you." Jake leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Thompson smiled, a hint of old pain in her eyes. "When I was about your age, I could barely read at all. The words jumbled together, dancing on the page like they were mocking me." Jake's eyes widened in recognition. That's how it is for me sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson reached out, patting his hand gently. "I know, dear. It's called dyslexia. Back in my day, they didn't have a name for it. They just thought I was slow." As Mrs. Thompson shared her story of struggle and eventual triumph over her reading difficulties, Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Here was living proof that his challenges could be overcome. "How did you do it?" Jake asked, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and hope. Mrs. Thompson's eyes twinkled. "Practice, determination, and a very patient teacher who believed in me. Sound familiar?" Jake nodded, thinking of Kate's unwavering support. "Yeah," he said softly, "it does." As Jake left Mrs. Thompson's house that afternoon, his step was lighter, his heart filled with a newfound determination. He clutched a book Mrs. Thompson had lent him, eager to share it with Kate during their next reading session. Back home, Kate noticed the change in Jake's demeanor immediately. "You look happy," she observed, a smile playing on her lips. "Good visit with Mrs. Thompson?" Jake nodded enthusiastically. "She told me about how she used to struggle with reading too," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "And she lent me this book. I thought maybe we could read it together." Kate's heart swelled with pride and affection. "Of course, Jake. I'd love that." As they settled into their usual spots for their reading session, Jake felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in a long time. With Kate's patient guidance, Mrs. Thompson's inspiring story, and his own growing determination, he felt ready to face the challenges ahead. That night, as Jake drifted off to sleep, his mind was filled not with anxiety about school, but with dreams of the stories yet to be discovered, the worlds waiting to be explored through the pages of books. For the first time in years, he looked forward to tomorrow, eager to continue his journey of growth and discovery. As the weeks passed, the relationship between Jake and Kate continued to evolve. Their nightly reading sessions became a sanctuary, a time filled with not just learning, but also laughter and shared confidences. The initial awkwardness had given way to a comfortable camaraderie, punctuated by inside jokes and gentle teasing. One evening, as they finished a particularly humorous chapter, Jake's laughter rang out, clear and uninhibited. Kate joined in, her eyes crinkling with genuine mirth. As their laughter subsided, Jake wiped tears from his eyes, a broad grin still plastered on his face. "You know," he said, his voice soft with realization, "I can't remember the last time I laughed like that." Kate's heart swelled with emotion. "It suits you," she replied warmly. Laughter looks good on you, Jake. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft ticking of the bedside clock. Then, without warning, Jake's expression grew serious. "Kate," he began, his voice hesitant. "Can I tell you something?" Kate nodded, sensing the importance of the moment. "Of course, Jake. You can tell me anything." Jake took a deep breath, his fingers fidgeting with the corner of his book. I used to hate the idea of you being here," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the bedspread. "I thought you were trying to replace my mom." Kate felt her breath catch in her throat, but she remained silent, allowing Jake to continue. "But now," Jake went on, his voice gaining strength, "I'm glad you're here. You're not trying to be my mom. You're Kate, and that's pretty great." Tears pricked at Kate's eyes as she reached out to squeeze Jake's hand. "Oh, Jake," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you could ever know." As they embraced, the last vestiges of the wall between them crumbled away. In that moment, they were no longer stepmother and stepson, but simply two people who cared deeply for one another. The next morning, David couldn't help but notice the change in the household atmosphere. The tension that had lingered for so long had been replaced by a warmth that seemed to permeate every corner. As he watched Jake and Kate chatting animatedly over breakfast, a mixture of joy and a twinge of something else, perhaps a hint of exclusion, washed over him. Later that day, David approached Jake in the living room. "Hey, buddy," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. "I was thinking maybe we could do some reading together tonight. Just the two of us?" Jake looked up, surprise evident on his face. For a moment, David feared rejection, but then Jake's expression softened. "Sure, Dad," he said with a small smile. "That'd be nice." That evening, as David settled into the chair by Jake's bed, an awkward silence fell over the room. It was clear that both father and son were acutely aware of Kate's absence. "So," David began, clearing his throat, "what are we reading?" Jake handed him the book, and David began to read aloud. His delivery was stilted at first, lacking the easy flow that Kate had developed over their many sessions. Jake found himself tensing, the words seeming to jumble more than usual without Kate's calming presence. As David stumbled over a particularly difficult passage, frustration evident in his voice, Jake felt a surge of anxiety. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," he muttered, reaching for the book. David's face fell, but he rallied quickly. No, he insisted. "I want to do this, Jake. It's important to me. Can we try again?" Jake hesitated, then nodded slowly. As they continued, with David making a visible effort to slow down and enunciate clearly, Jake began to relax. It wasn't the same as reading with Kate, but there was something comforting about his father's deep voice and earnest attempts. As they finished the chapter, David looked at Jake expectantly. "What did you think? Should we do this again sometime?" Jake considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'd like that, Dad." The next day, as Jake prepared for school, Kate noticed a flyer sticking out of his backpack. "What's this?" she asked, gently tugging it free. Jake's face flushed as Kate read the announcement for an upcoming reading competition at school. "It's nothing," he mumbled, reaching for the flyer. But Kate's eyes were alight with excitement. "Jake, this is wonderful. Are you thinking of participating?" Jake shrugged, his body language screaming discomfort. "I don't know. It's probably stupid." Kate knelt down, meeting Jake's eyes. "It's not stupid at all," she said firmly. "In fact, I think it's incredibly brave. You've come so far, Jake. You should be proud of yourself." Jake's expression wavered between hope and fear. "What if I mess up? What if everyone laughs?" Kate squeezed his shoulders gently. "Then you'll pick yourself up and try again, and I'll be right there, cheering you on. What do you say? Want to give it a shot? After a moment's hesitation, Jake nodded, a tentative smile playing on his lips. Okay, he said softly. I'll do it. As Jake headed off to school, his step a little lighter, Kate felt a swell of pride and affection. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to be there for Jake every step of the way. The reading competition loomed on the horizon, a challenge and an opportunity that would test not just Jake's progress, but the strength of their newfound bond as well. The days leading up to the reading competition were a whirlwind of emotions for Jake. Excitement warred with anxiety. Determination clashed with self-doubt. Each passing day brought the event closer, and with it, a growing sense of pressure that seemed to settle on Jake's shoulders like a heavy cloak. Kate noticed the change in Jake's demeanor immediately. His usual post-reading session cheerfulness was replaced by a tense silence, his brow furrowed in concentration as he pored over the text they'd chosen for the competition. One evening, as Jake stumbled over a passage for the third time, frustration evident in his voice, Kate gently closed the book. "Jake," she said softly, "why don't we take a break?" Jake looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and guilt. "But the competition's in 2 days," he protested weakly. "I have to get this right." Kate placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "And you will," she assured him. "But pushing yourself to the point of exhaustion isn't going to help. Let's talk about what's really bothering you." For a moment, Jake was silent, his fingers tracing the embossed letters on the book's cover. Then, in a rush, the words tumbled out. "What if I mess up? What if I freeze on stage? Everyone will laugh, and they'll all know how stupid I am." Kate's heart ached at the pain in Jake's voice. "Oh, Jake," she said, pulling him into a gentle hug. "You are not stupid. You're one of the bravest, most determined people I know, and no matter what happens on that stage, I'll be proud of you." Jake sniffled, burying his face in Kate's shoulder. "You promise?" "I promise," Kate said firmly. "And you know what? I bet your dad feels the same way." At the mention of his father, Jake tensed slightly. "Dad? He doesn't really understand," he mumbled. Kate pulled back, meeting Jake's eyes. "Have you talked to him about how you're feeling?" Jake shook his head, looking away. Kate considered for a moment, then stood up. "Come on," she said, holding out her hand. "I think it's time we had a family meeting." Downstairs, they found David in his study, engrossed in work as usual. He looked up in surprise as Kate and Jake entered. "Everything okay?" he asked, noting the serious expressions on their faces. Kate nudged Jake forward gently. "Jake has something he'd like to talk to you about," she said, giving Jake an encouraging nod. Haltingly at first, then with increasing speed, Jake poured out his fears about the upcoming competition. David listened intently, his expression softening as he realized the depth of his son's anxiety. When Jake finished, David stood up and crossed the room, kneeling down to meet his son's eyes. "Jake," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I had no idea you were feeling this way. I'm so sorry I didn't notice." Jake shrugged, looking down at his feet. "It's okay, Dad. I didn't really want anyone to know." David placed his hands on Jake's shoulders. "Listen to me, Jake. You don't have to do this competition if you don't want to, but if you do, your mom and I will be there, cheering you on, and no matter what happens, we'll be proud of you. You've already come so far." Jake's eyes widened at his father's words, particularly the casual inclusion of Kate as Mom. He glanced at Kate, who was watching the scene with tears in her eyes. You'd really come?" Jake asked, his voice small. David nodded emphatically. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he said with a smile. For the first time in days, Jake felt the knot of anxiety in his chest begin to loosen. He wasn't alone in this. He had Kate, he had his dad, and together, they believed in him. The night before the competition, Jake lay in bed, his mind racing. But instead of the paralyzing fear that had gripped him earlier, he felt a cautious optimism. He thought of Kate's patient guidance, his father's newfound support, Mrs. Thompson's inspiring story. He thought of how far he'd come, from struggling to read a single page to preparing for a reading competition. As he drifted off to sleep, Jake made a decision. Win or lose, he would do his best tomorrow, and that, he realized, was something to be proud of. The morning of the competition dawned bright and clear. As Jake stood backstage, waiting for his turn, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. But when he looked out into the audience and saw Kate and his father sitting side by side, their faces beaming with pride and encouragement, he felt a surge of courage. Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped onto the stage, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as Jake took his place at the podium. The bright lights felt uncomfortably warm on his face, and the sea of expectant faces before him seemed to stretch endlessly. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. But then his eyes found Kate and David in the audience, their encouraging smiles anchoring him in the storm of his emotions. Jake took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he opened the book to the marked page. The room fell silent, the weight of anticipation palpable in the air. He glanced up at the judges, their pens poised over their notepads, then back down at the text before him. With one final steadying breath, Jake began to read. His voice, hesitant at first, gained strength with each word. The story, a tale of adventure and self-discovery that he and Kate had chosen together, flowed from his lips, painting vivid images in the minds of his listeners. As he read, the world around him seemed to fade away, leaving only the words on the page and the sound of his own voice. But then, halfway through a particularly complex sentence, Jake felt his rhythm falter. The familiar panic began to rise in his chest as the words on the page seemed to blur and dance before his eyes. For a terrifying moment, he was certain he would freeze, unable to continue. In that instant of crisis, Jake's eyes instinctively sought out Kate in the audience. She met his gaze steadily, her face a picture of calm confidence. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, and in that simple gesture, Jake found the strength to push through. Remembering the techniques Kate had taught him, Jake took a subtle breath, refocused on the text, and pressed on. His voice, though slightly shaky, did not falter again. Word by word, sentence by sentence, he made his way through the passage. As he spoke the final words, a hush fell over the auditorium. For a heartbeat, Jake stood frozen at the podium, the silence ringing in his ears. Then, like a wave breaking on the shore, applause erupted from the audience. Jake looked up, startled by the enthusiastic response. His eyes found Kate and David once more. They were on their feet, clapping vigorously, pride radiating from their faces. Even from a distance, Jake could see the tears glistening in Kate's eyes. David's usual reserved demeanor had given way to unabashed joy, his face split by a wide grin. As Jake made his way back to his seat, he felt a curious mixture of relief, exhaustion, and exhilaration. He had done it. Regardless of the outcome, he had faced his fears and read in front of an audience, something that would have been unthinkable just a few months ago. The rest of the competition passed in a blur. Jake listened to the other participants with half an ear, his mind still replaying his own performance, analyzing every word, every breath. When the last reader finished and the judges retired to deliberate, the nervous tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Jake fidgeted in his seat, alternating between hope and dread. Part of him dared to dream of victory, while another part insisted that he had surely made too many mistakes to place. The wait seemed interminable. Finally, the head judge approached the microphone, a sealed envelope in hand. The room fell silent once more as he cleared his throat and began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard some remarkable readings today. Every participant should be proud of their performance. However, we can only choose 3 winners. Jake held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone around him must be able to hear it. In 3rd place, the judge paused for dramatic effect, Jake Thompson. For a moment, Jake sat frozen in disbelief. Had he heard correctly? It wasn't until the people around him started clapping and nudging him that he realized it was true. He had won 3rd place. In a daze, Jake made his way to the stage to accept his certificate. As he shook the judge's hand, he caught sight of Kate and David in the audience once more. They were both on their feet again, applauding wildly, their faces shining with pride and joy. As Jake returned to his seat, clutching his certificate, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't just the pride of placing in the competition, though that was certainly part of it. It was the realization that he had people who believed in him, who supported him no matter what. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt truly, deeply happy. The competition concluded with photos and congratulations, but Jake barely noticed any of it. He was eager to get to Kate and David, to share this moment with them. As soon as he was free, he rushed through the crowd, certificate in hand. Kate enveloped him in a tight hug the moment he reached them. "Jake, I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As Kate released him, David stepped forward, his eyes suspiciously bright. "That was incredible, son," he said, pulling Jake into a fierce embrace. "You were amazing up there." Surrounded by the warmth of their love and pride, Jake felt invincible. He had faced one of his biggest fears and come out victorious. As they left the auditorium together, Jake walking between Kate and David, he realized that this was more than just a win in a reading competition. It was a turning point, a moment that would forever change how he saw himself and his abilities. With Kate's unwavering support and his father's newfound understanding, Jake felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The future, which had once seemed so daunting, now held the promise of endless possibilities. The drive home from the competition was filled with an electric energy. Jake sat in the back seat, his certificate clutched tightly in his hands, as Kate and David chatted animatedly in the front. Their voices washed over him, a comforting backdrop to the whirlwind of emotions still swirling inside him. As they pulled into the driveway, Jake noticed Mrs. Thompson standing on her porch, waving enthusiastically. Word of his success had clearly traveled fast. Jake felt a rush of warmth for the kind old lady who had shared her own story of struggle and triumph. The moment they stepped inside the house, Kate turned to Jake, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "So, how does it feel to be an award-winning reader?" she asked, her voice filled with pride. Jake grinned, a blush creeping up his neck. "Pretty amazing," he admitted. "I still can't believe it happened." David clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Believe it, son. You earned every bit of it with your hard work." As the initial excitement began to settle, Jake found himself overcome with gratitude. He looked at Kate, words suddenly failing him. How could he express what her support had meant to him? "Kate," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you. Thank you for everything." Kate's eyes welled up with tears. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, David interjected. "Jake's right, Kate," he said, his tone serious. "You've been incredible through all of this. I don't think I've properly thanked you for what you've done for our family." A shadow passed over Kate's face, so quickly that Jake almost missed it. She smiled, but there was a hint of something, sadness, guilt, in her eyes. "I'm just glad I could help," she said softly. "Jake did all the hard work." David shook his head, taking a step closer to Kate. "No, it's more than that. You've brought something special to this family, Kate. I think it's time we talked about—" Suddenly, Kate's phone rang, cutting through the moment. She glanced at the screen, her face paling slightly. "I'm sorry," she muttered. "I have to take this." As Kate hurried from the room, Jake felt a strange tension settle over the atmosphere. He looked at his father, confusion evident on his face. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Jake," he said hesitantly, "there's something I need to talk to you about. About Kate." Jake's heart rate picked up, a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. "What is it, Dad? Is everything okay?" David opened his mouth to respond, but at that moment, Kate reappeared in the doorway. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling slightly. "David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I speak with you privately for a moment?" Jake watched as his father followed Kate out of the room, their hushed voices drifting back to him. He couldn't make out the words, but the urgency in their tones was clear. Left alone, Jake's mind raced with possibilities. What was going on? Was Kate in some kind of trouble? The joy of his earlier triumph faded, replaced by a gnawing worry. After what felt like an eternity, David and Kate returned. Their faces were serious. The earlier celebratory mood completely dissipated. "Jake," David began, his voice gentle but firm, "there's something we need to tell you. It's about Kate's past." Kate stepped forward, her eyes meeting Jake's. The warmth and affection he'd grown accustomed to seeing there was still present, but now it was tinged with fear and something that looked a lot like regret. "Jake," she said softly, "I haven't been entirely honest with you and your father. There are things about my past that I've kept hidden, things that I'm not proud of." Jake felt as if the floor was tilting beneath him. He looked from Kate to his father and back again, struggling to understand. What kind of things?" he managed to ask, his voice small and uncertain. Kate took a deep breath, steeling herself. "It's a long story, Jake, but you deserve to know the truth. All of it." As Kate began to speak, her voice low and measured, Jake felt the world he'd come to know over the past few months begin to shift and change. The woman he'd come to trust, to care for, suddenly seemed like a stranger. And yet, as he listened to her story unfold, he realized that the core of who she was, the kindness, the patience, the unwavering support, remained unchanged. The room fell silent as Kate finished speaking, the weight of her revelations hanging heavy in the air. Jake sat frozen, trying to process everything he'd just heard. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: shock, confusion, hurt, and beneath it all, a stubborn current of affection for the woman who had helped him overcome so much. As the silence stretched on, Jake realized that both Kate and his father were watching him, their faces etched with concern and uncertainty. They were waiting for his reaction, he realized, waiting to see how this revelation would change things. In that moment, Jake understood that he stood at a crossroads. His response now would shape the future of their family, for better or worse. With a deep breath, he prepared to speak, knowing that his words would carry the weight of forgiveness, understanding, and the complex, messy reality of family bonds. The silence in the room was deafening as Jake struggled to find his voice. Kate's revelation hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Jake's mind raced, trying to reconcile the woman he'd grown to care for with the person she'd just revealed herself to be. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us before?" Kate's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd reject me, that I'd lose this family we've been building." David stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Kate's shoulder. "Kate came to me a few weeks ago," he explained, his voice gentle but firm. "She wanted to tell us then, but I asked her to wait. I thought we needed more time to strengthen our relationships first." Jake's eyes widened in surprise. "You knew?" he asked his father, a hint of betrayal in his voice. David nodded, his expression pained. "I did. And I'm sorry I kept it from you, Jake. I was trying to protect you, but I see now that wasn't the right choice." The room fell silent again as Jake processed this new information. His emotions were a tangled mess: hurt at the deception, anger at being kept in the dark, and beneath it all, a deep-seated fear of losing the family unit they'd worked so hard to build. Suddenly, Jake stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I need some air," he muttered, heading for the door. "Jake, wait," Kate called out, her voice desperate. But Jake was already gone, the front door slamming behind him. Outside, the cool night air hit Jake's face, clearing his head slightly. He began to walk, no particular destination in mind, just needing to move, to process. As he walked, memories of the past few months flashed through his mind. Kate's patient guidance during their reading sessions, her unwavering support at the competition, the way she'd brought laughter and warmth back into their home. And yet, beneath all that was a lie, a secret that threatened to unravel everything they'd built. Jake found himself at the local park, deserted at this late hour. He sank onto a bench, his head in his hands. Back at the house, Kate and David sat in tense silence, both lost in their own thoughts. "I've ruined everything," Kate whispered, her voice thick with regret. David shook his head. "No, we both made mistakes here. We should have been honest from the start." As the minutes ticked by with no sign of Jake, their worry grew. Just as David was about to go look for him, they heard the front door open. Jake walked into the living room, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Kate and David stood, anxiety etched on their faces. "Jake," Kate began, her voice pleading. "I'm so sorry. I know I should have—" "Stop," Jake interrupted, his voice surprisingly calm. "I've been thinking about everything you've told me, about the past few months, about family." He took a deep breath, looking from Kate to his father, and back again. "What you did, it was wrong. You should have told me the truth from the beginning." Kate nodded, tears streaming down her face. "But," Jake continued, his voice softening slightly, "I've also been thinking about second chances, about how people can change, can become better versions of themselves." He turned to Kate, meeting her eyes directly. "You've been there for me, Kate. You've helped me in ways I didn't even know I needed. That has to count for something." Relief washed over Kate's face, but Jake held up a hand, not finished. "I'm not saying I forgive you, not yet, but I'm willing to try, to work through this, because you're family now, and family doesn't give up on each other." David stepped forward, pulling Jake into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you, son," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. As David released him, Jake turned to Kate. For a moment, they stood facing each other, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Then slowly, Jake held out his hand. Kate took it, her grip firm despite her trembling fingers. "Thank you, Jake," she whispered. "I promise, no more secrets, no more lies." Jake nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Okay," he said simply. As the three of them stood there, hands linked in a circle, Jake realized that this was what family truly meant. It wasn't about perfection or flawless pasts. It was about acceptance, forgiveness, and the willingness to work through the hard times together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But as Jake looked at Kate and his father, he felt a surge of determination. They had overcome so much already. With honesty, patience, and love, they could overcome this too. As they settled in for a long night of talking, sharing, and healing, Jake understood that this was just another chapter in their family's story. And like the books he'd learned to love, every chapter, no matter how difficult, was essential to the overall narrative. In that moment, surrounded by the imperfect yet unbreakable bonds of family, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. As she closed the door behind her, Kate leaned against the wall, overwhelmed by the progress they'd made. It was a small step, but a significant one. For the first time since she'd married David, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could be more than just Jake's father's wife. Inside his room, Jake picked up the book again, running his fingers over the cover. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he wasn't alone in this struggle.